Thanks, Tyler. Thank you.
Very nice.
So, are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I hope you were able to run off the little one page, or actually, I guess you have 2 pages of the script that I'm going to be using tonight. And what I'm going to be doing is encouraging as many of you as possible. If you ever want to respond to something or question it, just go ahead and interrupt. We'll see how this all works. But if you don't want the dog to be heard, you might just take that little red button down at the bottom left and make sure that we don't hear too much of the dog. Well, tonight we're going to be looking at a very amazing person that is not well known in scripture or in public, in the church. And yet for me, he's probably one of the most important characters. And hopefully by the time we're done tonight, you are going to be looking at that saying, oh my goodness, if Barnabas had not been right in those moments, where would we be today? And I think we're going to be kind of stunned at how important little things that you and I do can really have a profound effect. So, how many of you do have the script? Did any of you print it off? Oh, okay. So I will, some of it probably isn't, well, we'll just see how it works. You'll see where we're going and hopefully that'll help. So Barnabas, how many of you feel like you have really been introduced to Barnabas before? I know a couple of you preachers probably have.
I have.
Yeah.
One thing, John, I just went to the CKPC because I hadn't downloaded it, but I don't see it on there, on our website.
Oh, I think it was in the email that came today.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, that's all right. We can get it to you later. So you don't have to take notes. So this Barnabas fella is introduced in Acts chapter 4, verses 36 and 37. And it just simply says this: thus Joseph. Notice it doesn't say Barnabas.
Right now.
But it does go on to say, who was surnamed by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. At least in my version, that's what it says. He was a Levite, a native from Cyprus. Okay, I have, how can I say this? I understand that from time to time, when people move from the King James or some other version into the RSV or some other version, they became a little distraught with the fact that some words had changed. Are any of you familiar with those kind of situations? It happens all the time. Well, it's interesting. We need to really look at this word Barnabas. You know, names were not given casually. Names were given because there was a real sense of meaning. And the name Barnabas, Barnabas. And it's the word bar, very good. The word bar is the Hebrew word, not the Greek word, but the Hebrew word for son. And then Nabas is the word for that was translated in the Old Testament prophet. And so he's given this name, Barnabas, which means son of, well, why is it son of encouragement? Well, let me tell you, there's some real problems translating it. I know of a young pastor that's had some challenges dealing with blessed and happy in translations. I don't know if any of you know of a pastor like that. But if you think he has a problem with that one, you ought to try to understand this word paraclete in the Greek. Paraclete can be translated in different places. If you look for a singular translation of this word in any of your Bibles, you're going to find a smattering of different words. So let me read some of them. It can be translated counselor, advocate, to beg, to urge, to conciliate, to appeal, to encourage, to give instruction, comforter. What did I say?
Console.
Okay, console. All right, I misread one there. Sorry about that. Thank you, Pam. And appeal, exhort, or beseech. So if you see those words in your translation, you're probably going to be looking at the word in Greek, paraclete. And there are reasons why it is changed from time to time. And Jim Davis is an expert in these things, so he can try to straighten out the mess. But I want us to be very clear that this is not an easy thing to understand. The role of Barnabas, who is named he's called the Paraclete. And I personally really love this phrase, or this word, cum forte, comforter. Cum is with, forte. I'm sitting next to a piano. Who can tell me what the actual name of a piano is?
Pianoforte.
There it is. It's a piano forte. And it means you can play it soft or you can play it strong, not necessarily loud, but strong. And in a very similar way, this word is such a dynamic thing. And when you watch this incredible fellow by the name of Barnabas working with people, you see this myriad. One moment he's prophetic, and another moment he's comforting. Another moment he's ready to tear Paul's whatever apart. And it's a tremendous, tremendous word. So I want us to understand Barnabas. He is prophetic in the way that he is to be able to bring God in multiple situations to people with strength. There's another one, and if you have your cheat sheet there, you can go ahead and say, who is the one that is called the Comforter or the Paraclete in John chapter 14, 26? Who is it? Some of you are muted, I think. The Holy Spirit.
Holy Spirit.
Yes, absolutely, the Holy Spirit. Now, Barnabas, we first meet him there, and he's a Levite. There's some consideration whether Levites were really supposed to own property, because they were supposed to be cared for by the other tribes. Now, there's some conjecture whether that's true at this moment in history, but you find that this Joseph, this Barnabas, is a Levite from the Isle of Cyprus. You know where Cyprus is?
Mm-hmm.
Let me just do a quick, can you see a map here? Or do you see somebody else? Can you see a map?
Yep.
Cyprus is that little island down there, right below Asia Minor. And it's very important to understand that this work is done not mainly in Jerusalem, but it is done up in Asia Minor. And you remember, hopefully, if you were with my class on Revelation, we're going to be meeting the Gauls again. And it's a fascinating thing. So, any questions at this point? I want to stop here, and any, who is this guy? What do you think he would be like to know him? Comments? Go ahead. I hear somebody wiggling a mic. Go for it. Okay, we'll move ahead. So the very next thing in Acts, after we are introduced to Barnabas, we are also then introduced to Ananias and Sapphira. What happened to them? They gave a partial offering, remember, to the church. And where Barnabas had sold his property, he gave everything to the church. The very next thing that happens is that Ananias and Sapphira, they decide to pocket some of the money that they had sold instead of giving it all to the church. So when we have stewardship, Tyler, you can let me do the sermon coming up on Stewardship Sunday, and we'll go with that. I hope you know I'm teasing. Any comments? Don't hesitate. All right, let's move on. Yeah, go ahead.
I had heard that it wasn't that they kept some money back, is that they lied that they kept it back.
Yeah, I think that really is the appropriate way to say it. That's true. Good, good. Yeah, be honest about what you do. And I don't know if any of you remember my guideline for what you should give to the church was something like this. If you're feeling angry about giving, then you're probably giving too much. If you're feeling guilty, you're probably not giving enough. So try to squeeze it in between those two. And I think you'll find that God really works in that kind of thing for us. Well, I think that's an aside. Okay, let's keep moving. The next time we meet Barnabas, we find him just after Saul has been converted. I think we heard about Saul last week, and actually for the last several weeks. Paul has this amazing conversion, and you remember that he's blinded. And there's a fellow by the name of Ananias. By the way, make sure that you understand that there, in the book of Acts alone, there are 3 different Ananiasi. I don't know, how do you say the plural of Ananias? But there are 3 of them, and you have to make sure that you know which is which. This is the second one, and the third one, not a nice guy at all. But Ananias is, as you remember, is brought by the Lord to Saul, who is blind, and you remember that whole experience. Well, then, it's fascinating to me, this whole timeline. I'm afraid that so many people, when they have accepted Christ, they expect to be mature, evangelical, missionary Christians within the next few days or months or maybe year. But we find that that Paul goes to Arabia. Arabah is the desert. We don't know exactly where he went, but he went out there. And then he came back, not to Jerusalem, but he came back to Damascus. After about 3 years, now put that in your head. After about 3 years, now he goes to Jerusalem for 15 days. And he visits with Peter and James, Jesus' brother, and then leaves. It's fascinating that we have this kind of compressed view of the way Paul, and I know I'm talking about Barnabas, but you'll see why. Paul is seen to be this one who accepts the Lord. He is turned around, and we do know that he did teach, and he preached, but we don't really have any of the dramatic recording of what he did for, well, what is it? It's either 14 or 17 years. We're not sure of the exact datings on those. Depends if you add the 3 years in or if you don't. And some scholars say this and some say that. It doesn't really matter. It's a long time of preparation and patience. But then you'll remember that there's a dispute in the church. Have you ever known of a church that's had a dispute? Heaven forbid. Now, churches are never supposed to have that. Well, they have one. And it is over, well, what was it over? Do you remember? Anyone dare to say the word? Unmute yourself and yell out the word.
Observing
Remember?
the Jewish law.
What's that?
Observing the Jewish law. Whether
Yeah, and specifically
circumcision.
circumcision. So very important for us to understand. Now Paul is working among Jews, but also in a Gentile community. And now there arises the question, do Gentiles have to be circumcised like Jews do? And this leads, as you probably remember, into a tremendous conflict in the church. And here is where we find Barnabas, again, coming to the forefront. It's interesting, always watch when you're reading, especially in the book of Acts, what name comes first. And we find that when now they are in trouble, they have to go to defend themselves because they're letting people become Christians without circumcising them. And the Jewish people are really, really upset because, well, when did circumcision start? Circumcision started not with Moses and the law. It started with Abraham. And so here is something, and when you stop and think about, put yourself in Germany during Hitler's reign. How did the people understand that, oh, okay, here's a Jewish man, is pretty evident. Circumcision has been the mark of the Jewish people for years and years and years. So now we're about, let's say 16 years roughly into Paul's, or after the time of Jesus, and the church is already having a dispute. And it's a vicious one. Paul and Barnabas are sent from Jerusalem up to Antioch. Now, Antioch is kind of above Lebanon, so you have Israel and Lebanon, and Antioch is just before it kind of bends over towards Greece in that area. It's interesting that the word Christian, how many of us claim to be Christians? Well, we all do. And it's fascinating that in the Bible, that word is used 3 times. And the first time, they were first called Christians in Antioch. And that means Christ follower, as we all know. So now this whole issue of circumcision is growing. And I had a book one time that was really fun. It was what young people have done, like in high school. They have used wrong words on essays. And one of my favorites is that Magellan circumcised the world in a 40-foot clipper. And they obviously didn't know any of those words. So this whole thing of circumcision is, it's a horribly divisive issue. I mean, if we have divisive issues in the church today, we haven't faced anything like that first century church faced. So you have the Jewish Christ followers that are encountering the Greek world. They are living not far from Ephesus. Tyler, I think there's a picture I would like you to put up just for a moment and see if anybody, unmute yourselves because I want to see who knows what this thing is. Tyler, can you put it up? There it is, coming.
Toilets. Toilets.
Yeah, how many of you have seen these in person? Yeah, and this is at Ephesus, and when you're coming down the hill, you remember?
Yep.
On your right-hand side, you're invited to go and see where the men's toilets were. And these are the toilets of Paul's times. And so when we think of nudity, we think of circumcision, we think of those kind of things, we think of them from a very much post-evangelical crusades, pietism. But back then, they didn't have any places, McDonald's to stop and use their restroom and buy French fries to pay for it or whatever. So Barnabas is having to deal with this horribly difficult challenge. Any questions or comments at this point? And I really hope we'll get some discussion. So please, does any of this make sense? Because where we're going is going to get tougher. We're doing good? Okay. So now we look at the Jerusalem Council. This is absolutely fascinating to me. It's about 48 AD, about 15 years after the crucifixion. And now Paul and Barnabas, and now we add Peter. They come and they have to present to the council. That's interesting that there's already a council of Christians that are making decisions for the church. And they have to make a presentation. It is Peter that starts it. Barnabas continues. Paul explains it in detail. And finally, James, interestingly, announces the decision. Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from the pollutions of idols, and from unchastity, and from what is strangled, and from what is blood, and from blood. I have always looked at that, and I suppose I'm going to have to ask some of my other colleagues here, why were those four things picked? And circumcision set aside. Anyone want to go after that? Jim, I see you face to face there. Any comments?
These four things are emblematic of Jewish traditions in different ways, probably mostly in terms of table fellowship, and in the same way that circumcision was something that marked out Jews, table fellowship was something that divided the races in the ancient world. And so these things have to do with things that can be eaten and things that were a part of or not a part of table fellowship, depending on what ethnicity you were.
Yeah, okay, that's really helpful. Yeah, it's fascinating that they take this most holy thing and say, no, you don't have to do it. We'll see this come back again. So the whole concept of circumcision is the most troublesome. What are the kind of things we've fought over in this last few years? I don't even want to hear the list. Having been ordained in the infamous year of 1967, that split the church right down the middle. Well, not really down the middle, but it split it horribly. I have seen over and over and over issues that split the church. It's interesting that after after the issue has been settled of circumcision, Barnabas disappears. The first thing we learn about him is that he sold property and gave it to the church. The next thing is that he is helping Paul get acquainted into the church and giving him a validation. He really stood up for him. And then, actually, I'm a little bit ahead of myself there. They have a missionary journey that they are going to continue on. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, but now I want you to begin to think about the names that you're going to be hearing and how we rely on these different people and what they have given to us. So I want to start with a fellow by the name of Mark. Those of you who have a little cheat sheet might know where I'm going with this. Mark chapter 14 and verse 52 says that there was a young man in the garden when Jesus was arrested. And do you remember what happened to that young man? Yeah. The guards tried to grab him, and what did they get?
His clothes,
They got his clothes, and he ran away
stark naked.
stark naked. That's right. And I think we don't know for sure that that's Mark. I want to be very clear about that. But at the same time, it would fit that he was there and that possibly was Mark. That may be our introduction to this fellow. And he certainly would have known about the crucifixion of Jesus in an amazing way. In Acts chapter 12, verse 12, we see that when Peter realized that, do you remember when Peter was thrown into prison and he was bound there and there was an earthquake? Remember that story?
Mm-hmm.
So there was the earthquake and the door flies open and they're released. And when Peter realized this, I think that's a fascinating thing. I mean, he's going, whoa, what's happening? And all of a sudden he realizes what's happened. And he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And there's that kind of a funny thing where he's knocking on the door, remember, and what happened. They were so excited that they ran in to tell everybody inside and forgot to unlock the door and let them in. There's some wonderful little side of humor. So we have this introduction to this young man, John Mark. Now then, in Acts chapter 12 and verse 25, we find that Barnabas and Saul, when they returned from Jerusalem, when they had fulfilled their mission, the mission there being dealing with the issue of circumcision, they brought with them John, whose other name was Mark. Now, if you remember the story, and I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but it's absolutely fascinating. Mark, for some reason, and I think sometimes he's been overly besmirched, but he wanted to go back home. And Paul takes it that this young man is chickening out, or for some reason, and Paul is not at all pleased with the fact that Mark doesn't want to go with them. And it becomes such a contest that here two of the leaders of the early church, Barnabas and Paul, now think about it. I mean, Barnabas is the one that introduces Paul to the disciples and paves the way for him. He's done all of these things, and now these two, they are just flashing. And what happens? You remember the story. Paul and Silas go one way, and Mark and Barnabas go the other. By the way, we are also told that Barnabas is what kind of a relationship to Mark? They're cousins. Now, sometimes that doesn't have quite the precise meaning that we would have in an ancestry file, for instance. But there's certainly a close relationship and probably, possibly, even a physical relationship in family, which I want you to think about, because you've got Peter, James, and their brothers. You have other people that have known each other, and this is really a small group of people and kind of intertwined. They've known each other, worked together, and it's out of those groups that the gospel is ultimately developed. Well, when Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem, when they had fulfilled their mission, they brought with them John, whose nickname was, or surname, the other name was Mark. There was this division, and I want us to understand these words. And there arose a sharp contention, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark and sailed away to Cyprus, Paul to Cilicia. We're going to run across a woman by the name of Lydia. And I want to come back to the baptism issue again. Circumcision was for whom? Men. I think it's absolutely fascinating that the very next person after the Council of Jerusalem makes its statement of which way it's going to go. I think it's absolutely fascinating that it's a woman who is now mentioned to be baptized. In Acts chapter 16, verses 14 and 15, Lydia from Thyatira, now listen to that, Lydia from Thyatira up in Philippi, remember that was one of the 7 churches mentioned later on in the book of Revelation. And she was a working woman. We know that she sold purple dye, clothes with purple dye, which was regal. And so it's absolutely fascinating, I think, to see what has happened for women when they move from baptizing or circumcising men exclusively to now opening up the same entrance into the church for both men and women. Okay, anything you want to respond to at this point? Have I put you to sleep totally? Apparently.
Not apparently.
Okay, go ahead. Who said what? Somebody spoke, I thought. Nope. Okay. So I want us to really focus in on the fact of 2 mission fields. When Barnabas and Paul split off from Mark and well, when they all split up, it's fascinating that Paul goes to the circumcised and Barnabas and Mark go to the non-circumcised. And I think this is so very important for us to understand. And we're going to come back to this in a few minutes, a couple of minutes. I think it's so important for us to understand that our Christian faith, right from its inception, was designed to have different expressions of how that faith works out. And it's very, very important for us, I think, to understand that not everyone is going to look like a me or you, and how we can learn to appreciate people who express faith in different ways. I had a chat with Don earlier this week, and talked to Don about his experience with the Coptic Church. And it's a very fascinating thing, and the Coptics have felt very estranged. Now, who's in charge of this estrangement? Well, I'm not sure that that's the right question. Who's the one that still is the common bond between them, and it's Jesus. And so I think as we look at the different expressions of our faith, we can learn from Barnabas, Paul, Luke, Mark, and Titus. By the way, Titus, remember in the New Testament book, he wasn't circumcised. And he wasn't forced to be circumcised. And he wrote the book of Titus. That's heresy, if you stop and think about it, from 2,000 years of Jewish history. So it's a real challenge. Peter, John, James, and Jude, on the other hand, are really looking at the role of circumcision in a different way, and they're going specifically to the Jewish people. Okay, any comments before I finish up on this last item? Jim, you were saying something. I don't know why, but you are on the screen right in front of me here. Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot. Anyone? Different views are fine, absolutely.
I
Would
forget.
you like me to?
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
No, I was going to say, what would you like me to comment on, John?
Whatever you'd like to.
I think Carol was going to say something.
Okay,
maybe.
Carol?
Yeah, go ahead.
There was another voice in there someplace.
Yeah, it was someone else that chimed in.
I was going to ask. There was somebody rather that went with Paul that was specifically circumcised after. Was that Timothy, or because it seemed to me that he had one guy with him that he specifically wasn't circumcised, another guy that was circumcised just so everybody would be happy or something.
You're right.
Is that?
Yeah, that's right. And so it becomes that kind of an optional thing, but it doesn't become that forced issue. Ultimately, let me say it as concisely as I can. What they decided in the Jerusalem Council was that you did not have to become Jewish to become Christian.
Mhm.
Now, that doesn't mean we throw away that Jewish heritage and the Old Testament. We don't become New Testament Christians excluding what God has done in that, but leading up to this new experience in Jesus Christ. Does that help? So yes, some were and some weren't. Anyone else?
Okay, so Lydia was a Gentile, right?
Yes,
And so she was baptized
yes,
as a Christian.
as a Christian.
We didn't have to go to any of the Jewish stuff.
That's right. Yeah, and now I wish, this is one of the problems of the trying to understand the Bible.
Mhm.
And it is also the thing that generates so many volumes of commentaries. So you begin to ask these questions. Well, what did she do? Did she follow up? How did she relate with others? They decide not to tell the story. And I think there's something good about that, because what it does, it puts it into our hands and it asks us with every situation that comes along, how are we going to deal with it and represent the God who is represented in Abraham, but also in Christ. So it becomes a real challenge.
Certainly.
I think also that we don't remember that really Christianity in its fullest separated from Judaism was not really established till Constantine, because really, everything that they did pretty much was their worship was
Mhm.
related to Judaism, to the Hebrew Old Testament, not what we think of as the way we go to a church that is a Protestant church and so forth, and all the things that we do that are so typically just what we call Christian, separated from Judaism. And that's really sad, because we lose so much of God's plan when we don't establish what God intended throughout redemptive history.
There's a wonderful German word, Heilsgeschichte, and it means redemptive or salvation history. And it just shows that whole flow right from from creation through Christ and into the church, and I think that's important for us to hear today too. That God has never lost control in the past, and God is not losing any control right now. We're going to be going through and are going through some challenging times, but somehow God is still here, and I take great comfort in that.
And John, one thing
Yes.
about Lydia, I think she was such a prestigious woman. It was very significant, I think, that she really helped Paul. And she was, you know, a great believer. And I thought that was significant because it wasn't just the poor or those that followed, it was also those that had influence.
Yes, it was across the spectrum. Absolutely. And the role of women, and I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but I think it's so important for us to understand the role of women. Ananias and Sapphira. No, that's not who I want. I want.
Bad example.
Yeah, bad example. Give me the good one. Brain freeze. Priscilla and Aquila.
Yeah.
Priscilla and Aquila. And if you look at the places in the book of Acts where they are mentioned, it starts out, Priscilla is mentioned first. That's a no-no. Who was it we were just talking with about when we were young? Do you remember that?
Oh, yes, I was talking about, I've been doing some things with scrapbooks. Anyway, I saw my mother's an article from the newspaper when she got married. There was no mention of any woman's first name, none. They were always Mrs. John Haberlin or Mrs. Carolyn. It would not be given at all. It'd be Mrs. Jim Davis or whatever, so yeah, it was way different then.
Yeah. And so the significance of this to me is radical. And it puts women in a role of being able to be called and to be able to minister and to be baptized, and you name it, they are not left out. And I thank God, I have to say, for the women who have taught me over the years.
There's a wonderful new book about Priscilla by a British New Testament scholar. Her name is Paula Gooder, and the book is simply called Priscilla, and I recommend it to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. What, as you have encountered it, can you give us just a little bit of what you feel about her perspective?
Well, Aquila and Priscilla have quite a story. They come originally from Rome. They're expelled by the Emperor Claudius. Paul meets them first in Corinth,
right,
and goes to work with them. And then later on, we find them in Ephesus when Paul is back there on his third missionary journey. After they've succeeded in teaching Apollos more accurately the way of the Lord, because he'd only heard about John the Baptist. So Priscilla's name also is mentioned as a diminutive, kind of a nickname as well. My real name is James, but everybody calls me Jim. Her real name was Priscilla. Her friends called her Prisca, and you find that name in the New Testament as well. And the mention of her name before her husband probably indicates that she was the one who was more gifted at teaching.
Yes.
But oftentimes in the Roman Empire, a woman's name will be mentioned first or only, like Lydia, because either their husband has not died or they are the person who was more well-born than their husband, who came from the higher stratas of Roman society, because Roman society is very stratified in terms of families. And what family you're from makes a big difference. So, yeah, there's a lot that goes into the understanding of women in the Roman Empire and women in Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you put that then into the context of those who were out of a rabbinic, male-dominated Old Testament, not that there weren't wonderful women in the Old Testament, but they didn't have the role in the same way. And now there's this new liberation. So anybody that says, well, this is the 20th century new emphasis, I don't think so. I think we need to really take a good look at what the Bible says. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else?
You get an off the wall question.
I love off the wall questions.
Why all the renaming? You got Saul that becomes Paul, Joseph that becomes Barnabas, John that becomes Mark, and there's many others. Why do they do that so much? It gets confusing.
That's why they did it. Yeah. Just to confuse us all. Sometimes I think that it's important to realize that in the Jewish context, especially, names had significance. And nicknames or second names had. Somebody want to comment?
Yes, that Don would like to.
Yeah, Don.
In the Old Testament, there, Deborah was the first judge, and a woman, and very, very strong. But there's one little thing there that it identified her husband as Labadoth. Labadoth. So I assumed a role of Labadoth as my spiritual name. So.
How about that? Well, that's cool.
That was nice.
Yeah, Labadoth. So refer to me as Labadoth.
Yeah, yes. I'll try to remember that, but it's going to take a while.
Yeah, and Casey, to come back to you one more time.
Yeah, sure.
Usually people in the Roman Empire had a first name, a family name, and a nickname.
Yeah.
And they could be called by any of those three names. So that's why you meet John Mark, or that's why you meet Saul Paulus. We have first, middle, and last names, but usually the first name was a given name. And John's right that often had significance. So in Paul's case, his first name is Saul. He's named after the first king of the tribe of Benjamin in the Old Testament. So first name is given by the parents to signify who the child is. Second name usually has something to do with the family or the tribe to which you belong if you're Jewish. And third name is your nickname. So, people called me all sorts of nicknames. And in high school, hardly anybody called me Jim.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Most of them had to do with basketball.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so important for us to understand, too, that Jacob wrestling with God, because he's wrestling with God, all of a sudden he is Hebrew. The name changed. So there are name changes there, and it could be second names, but they're significant. And so always look at the names and ask yourself the question, what does this name mean? I mean, today, I pity the teachers today. You go into a class of 30 kids and you have 28 names you've never heard before. And if you have heard those names, they are probably spelled differently than they were when you learned them. So the chaos wasn't there in the same way that we have it today. Well, just a couple more things, and then I have some follow-ups, and we'll see how far we go. In 2 Timothy chapter 4:11, there's this wonderful thing where it says, only Luke is with me. Paul, of course, is writing this. Get Mark and bring him with you. He is very helpful in serving me. So I think that there's something we really need to look at. Yes, there was a time when they went different directions, but now you see Paul and Mark coming back together. In Philemon, as Paul is writing to Philemon, Paul calls Mark and Luke my fellow workers. There's this sense of affirmation. And then in 1 Peter, Peter actually, assuming that Peter is the author, writes, I sends you, he mentioned someone sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. And so there's this wonderful thing where they launch into two separate worlds, the Jewish world to the Gentile world, and you see them beginning to come back together not to suppress what either of them have done, but now to become a part of this worldwide expansion. So I have some questions, and I hope you'll everybody unmute yourself. So I want to at least hear if you're snoring. Okay. I want us to think about the what ifs. What if Paul had never been accepted into the Christian community? What would we have lost? Potentially. Well, let me push it a little farther. If Barnabas had not befriended Saul, Mark, Luke, Matthew, and Titus, what would that have done maybe to our New Testament?
Be a lot shorter.
Yeah, could have been. Now, obviously, we understand that God has his hand in this, but God has that same hand in us. And as I asked you at the beginning to think about somebody who has really touched your life and made you different, I look back on innumerable. I tried to make a list one time, and I hit 90 and quit. Little words that were spoken, big things. And I think of Barnabas, hardly anybody knows about him. So go ahead. Someone's going to say something. Barnabas touched these lives, and as a result of it, we have the scriptures. I think that possibly, who knows how things would have gone, but I really am not excited about the whole idea of circumcision to become a Christian. And when we think of the Parakletos, I've had a couple, three of those people in my life that have mentored me. Not a lot. One of them was an architect in charge of all of the Neiman Marcus stores. And he was one of our youth advisors down in Hayward. And every once in a while he'd say, John, you and I need to talk. And I knew I was going to get it. But I never questioned his love for me, and he shaped my life. And I look back on innumerable people. So when somebody says, well, I know John Haberlin, I am, you know those pictures that we now have of all the people? I wish that could be made into me somehow, because that's the way I really am. Parakletos, comforter, the one who comes with strength.
Mm-hmm.
Who is that person in your life where you go and you find strength from them? It's a gift. How do we handle disagreement in the body of Christ? Sometimes we disagree, separate. Hopefully we'll recognize and serve that we are doing different ministries and come back together. In the unity of Christ, so important that, and I think my experience with General Assembly helped me more than anything to understand there's some people that I really disagree with theologically, but I see what God's doing through them. And I just kind of scratch my head and say, I don't get it, but I see it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
What do we learn about the missional and unity issues? Those of you who have the notes, there's a phrase that's very important to me. Various groups require different personalities. When I was doing, I don't think I mentioned this in this class, but when I was doing workshops all around the country, one of the things I asked them to do, which they were unwilling to do, I was doing it with churches, and they seemed very unwilling to do for one excuse or another. I said, go to your local high school at lunchtime Sit in a corner and watch all the different groups. And you'll see the cheerleaders, you're going to see the jocks, you're going to see the computer geeks, you're going to see the loner and the loner and the loner. You're going to see all these different people. And somehow, I think what this whole thing is teaching us is that we have to figure out as many different ways to reach people as possible. And it's not always going to be comfortable for me. I don't know, what do you think about that? You know, it's hard. I'd like everybody to be, no, I wouldn't like, Pam doesn't want everybody to be like me. I can guarantee you.
I'm not real crazy about the idea either.
What's that?
Nothing.
Go ahead, Don, I heard your voice.
Yeah, it was one I said, no, never mind.
Okay, all right.
I do, yeah. One of the questions I've had is, why did Paul always want to go east rather than west, which the Spirit said forbid him to do it? What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, if I heard the question, it's a little bit dim.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Why did he go east?
He
So
wanted
up
to
into
go
that area.
east.
Number one, he was from that area.
Yeah, that's true.
And number two, I think God was really helping the early church, both by the dispersion, the diaspora, but also by the calling to go to people who are different than them and bring a gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. That's good.
And the whole missional understanding of the gospel, I think we've lost it. We have not become Christians to sit in a church pew. We have become Christians to be the missional people of God, the ones sent for God's cause. And that's a tough one. Well, the final thing that we learn in this, and I think it's so important, I want to go back to the circumcision thing. And when the decision was made, the very last thing was that there was to be a common concern for the who. The poor. And that replaces, in the mind of the early church, it's one of the four things that replaces circumcision or gives a new emphasis to it. And so Tyler, that can be your sermon and whatever you want to do. We're 5 minutes behind, so I will quit. I hope you have come to see my friend Barnabas. And I thank God for the Barnabi that have put their arms around me. Sometimes I didn't want to hear what they said. Sometimes they cried with me. Sometimes they laughed with me. Sometimes it was that momentary thing and my life veered. And I am so thankful for so many that God has called to make me who I am, to make you who you are, and through us to make the world a different place. That's the way I understand Barnabas.
John, before you go, I think you'll enjoy Edith Edwards. Do you remember Bill and Edith Edwards?
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Edith in our Bible study class was sure. I mean, she didn't hesitate for a minute that Barnabas was definitely her favorite. She really wasn't too fond of Paul. And she really felt that Paul just had a better press agent, and really Barnabas should have gotten a whole lot more attention.
Thank you. I remember that in our Bible studies. Yes. In fact, I think that some of her challenges to me helped me understand who Barnabas was.
Yeah.
So I could be here tonight telling you who Barnabas was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Very good.
And that's the way God works. And these little seeds that are planted, you know, it's wonderful. Any other comments? Well, the one who comes with strength, the comforter, the boy, we all need him, and God will call certain people to be that, and we need to give them full attitude. Tyler, it's all yours.
I think that's, well, I don't know if we want a preview of next week. Thank you, John, first of all, for that great look at Barnabas. And yeah, how we do talk so much about Paul, but there's really a community at work for sure, and important figures. Jim, what do we got next week?
I heard an offer from your corner of the world, didn't I?
It is, well, no, I'm the 31st, I think.
Oh, that's right.
Uh,
Well, we got two previews. I want to give you the first one, but I wanted to whet your appetite with the second one as well. So some folks have been wanting to hear from Tyler, and he's going to come on the last Monday. We got 5 Mondays in the month of August, but next Monday, Bill Kettner is going to share his voice and perspective with us again. And that's always insightful. And I know you'll want to be with us for that. Bill, we look forward to hearing from you next week, and Tyler the week after that, and then we'll see where we're headed in September.
Sounds good.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you. Good to see
John.
everyone.
Thank you, John. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. God bless you all.